Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is episode 113, and a change of pace is coming your way. But before I begin the show, I want to let you guys know, as the previous few weeks have been the case, this week's show is brought to you by Podbean. Podbean is podcast hosting and monetization. It's the easiest way to start a podcast. If you visit podbean.com/TPD for the Podcast Digest, you'll learn more. You'll get the first month free, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. It's also brought to you by awesome people like you, those folks who are supporting the show on Patreon. There's only a handful of you right now, but you are wonderful souls, and I appreciate it so much. So this week's show is going to be a good one, folks. I mentioned it already, and I'm excited about this one. First of all, it has now been, for longtime listeners will know, on occasion, I'd like to say 8 to 10 episodes, I take a break from the normal interview format to bring to you what I call a recommendation show. And I bring somebody online with me, not to interview, but rather to co-host the Podcast Digest. And that's what we're doing this week. It has been 10 episodes. I believe the most recent one was back on August 6th, episode 103, with the awesome Quinn Rose. We talked 4 great shows that episode, and we're going to do it again now. Been about 2.5 months for episode 113, and my co-host this time, I am going back to the archives and continuing my absolute love affair with Couple Things Podcast. 1/4 of that show is Mr. Ben Mendenhall, and he is my co-host this week. Ben, welcome back to the Podcast Digest.
Dan, thank you for having me, sir. We are happy to be here. You are correct. I am 1/4 of the show for Couple Things Pod, and I put in about 1/10 of the effort. So I appreciate the plug.
Great, absolute great equation. You've got this whole thing figured out, man.
I'm coasting at this point, riding off everybody else's talent.
It's perfect. I am a huge freaking fan. Long-time listeners of the Podcast I just already know about my fanhood, but I'm going to tell new listeners a little bit about it. But before I do, Ben, if nobody's heard of Ben Mendenhall before or never heard a Couple Things Podcast, can you give them the 30,000-foot view? What is it that you guys do?
Yeah. So Couple Things Podcast is myself, my wife Molly, my friend Ray, and his wife Michelle, who I call Vonnie affectionately. And we have a barroom-style discussion every week where each of us brings one topic. It can be anything. Is a hot dog a sandwich? Are people inherently evil, which is not a popular topic? Anything that we want that we could bring to discuss. We'll typically take about 10 to 15 minutes per topic, give everybody our opinions on it, and go from there.
And I'll tell you, folks, there are people out there listening to this right now who have not heard Couple Things Podcast. And I'm telling you right now, this is something you need to correct immediately. Now, you guys know the whole basis of the Podcast Digest is for you guys to learn about some of the things that I love, and for me to take you behind the scenes with conversations with hosts and producers of great shows about how this awesome stuff gets made. No show has ever been featured on the rolls of the Podcast Digest in these 113 episodes, more than a couple of things. Ben, if you'll bear with me just a second, new listeners, I want to run down just a brief history to kind of show you guys exactly what I'm talking about here. Couple Things made their first appearance on the Podcast Digest, me talking about it way back on May 10th, 2015, way back on episode 38 of the Podcast Digest, on a show just like this, a recommendation show. I had a gentleman by the name of Ryan Steiner as my co-host that day, and we gave 2 show recommendations, and that's the very first time I told you guys about Couple Things Podcast. From there, it was on. 4 episodes later, I had the full cast of Couple Things. Ben just mentioned him, his wife, and their friends, Ray and Michelle. All 4 of them joined me on June 7th of 2015. So if you are a Couple Things fan, go back and listen to episode 42. 10 episodes later, in August of that year, I brought Ben's wife as the first host, A Couple Things, as my co-host for a recommendation episode. That was episode 52. 20 episodes later, at the end of the year, I recognized Couple Things again. My fandom was already through the roof. I did a little mini award show at the end of last year on episode 72, and I named Couple Things my independent podcast show of the year. 13 episodes later, I came back and brought Ben's friend Ray, co-host Ray Laughlin, back on the show for another recommendations episode. That was episode 85, April 3rd of this year. And now today, actually the longest break the Podcast Digest has had, 28 episodes since Ray's appearance. We bring Ben Mendenhall back for episode 113 in the recommendation show. So, Ben, that's the huge history of myself and the Podcast Digest with you and your cast of characters there at Couple Things.
I can't believe it's been that long since you had Ray on, but I also kind of get it. It's halftime. The first half is over. Molly and Ray came. We got to take a little break. Now we're bringing the heat for second half.
There you go. Yeah, and for those of you paying attention, Ben's referring to the fact that there is still one more host of Couple Things. That's Michelle von Hirschberg. That is Ray's wife, previous co-host Ray, who's still to come, and she will be on this show, and we will have a recommendations episode at some point in the future. Absolutely.
Oh, we've prepped her already, and we're starting to try to get her a little bit nervous. Like, all right, Bonnie, like, we're all doing great here. You kind of need to, like, bring your A game, okay?
I hope that everyone knows at this point that coming online with me and talking podcasts is nothing to be nervous about. I mean, this is good stuff.
Yeah, I'm positive Vonnie will crush it. I will probably fall flat, but Vonnie will do great.
So this isn't an interview, right? You're my co-host, but
we're buddies. I do
want to ask you one question, Ben.
Yeah.
One question, okay? Because I haven't had you on this show since June 7th of 2015, since episode 42. And I just want to ask you, from your perspective, you guys are now, I believe, 84 episodes in.
Very close. 83.
83 episodes in on the podcast, on Couple Things podcast. And what was funny was when we talked way back on episode 42, I predicted huge success and growth and this, that, and the other. And I noticed today, at the time of this recording, you guys have blown past 2,300 followers on Twitter. And I know the show has only grown over time. What has this ride been like for you guys, Ben?
You know, it's been really interesting just because when we first started the show, it was to call it a crapshoot would be putting it lightly. It was, hey, we're going to record. We're not even going to publish the first few episodes just because we kind of want to try it out. Then we kind of started to dabble our foot a little bit and say, all right, we're going to publish it and let's just see kind of how it goes. And it still just boggles my mind to this day that there's anyone that has any interest in listening to us talk. I mean, it literally just blows my mind. So to hear, people interact with us on Twitter and Instagram, and people talk about the topics and the participation that we've had in our CTP Fantasy Football League and our Twitter polls and our Twitter questions. It blows me away, really. And Molly does such a great job on the social media side, managing all that and keeping everything running and ticking in time. She just does a great job. So I've got to give a shameless plug to my wife there. But no, every day it's kind of wild. I had a coworker ask me the other day. He said, "What is it like to be living the dream and know that you're basically a G-list internet celebrity?" It's like, it's pretty good, man.
Confirm this for me, because this is my thought, is that you guys have obviously blown way past the idea of pod fading or, somebody losing interest. Obviously, this is going well for you guys. I know scheduling, you guys have done some unique things to kind of get around vacations and trips and things of that nature, but it almost sounds like, one of the best things about Couple Things is you guys sound like you have an absolute blast every time you sit down to do this. It almost sounds like, is there even any thoughts of not doing this? Could you guys even envision not sitting down to record?
I don't know that we could. And we've, when it first started, we always said there's no pressure. This isn't something that we want it to feel like it's a job that we've got to roll in and, okay, every Sunday or Saturday or whenever we got to record. But to even think about not doing it now just seems like such a foreign concept, because that's part of our weekend now. On Sundays, we record, we hang out with Ray and Vaughn, we have a great time. To think that wouldn't be something that would be on our weekend schedule at any point, I don't know. It just seems foreign.
It's encouraging to people, super fans like me, Ben, and so many others out there that I know exist. I make no shame about it. Like I said, no show has appeared more or had more mentions or airtime on my show than yours.
And
there's
we
a reason for that.
Appreciate it, Dan.
Yeah. And there's a reason for that. I knew it from the beginning, from the time I first started to listen to you guys. And you guys are great people, great senses of humor, great conversationalists. And it's something that I really encourage just about all of you listening to this right now to check out. And one other thing I just wanted to mention, because as of the time of this recording, the most recent episode, a couple of things, we'll also talk about me, and I want to make sure that this is not considered some type of quid pro quo here, pay for play politics going on in the podcasting world. But I was very lucky several weeks back, and folks who follow the show regularly know that I recently had Julie Shapiro, the executive producer of Radiotopia, as my guest. Great conversation. I love the opportunity to talk to her. Coming out of that conversation, a representative from their marketing team reached out to me and said, hey, would you mind doing sort of a written interview for our PRX blog that they like to talk to sort of podcast aficionados and hosts and things of that nature, and to kind of get their take on a lot of things. And so I said, that would be great. That'd be awesome. And what I did was they sent me a list of a dozen or so questions, and I got to pick 4 or 5 of those that I'd like to answer. And one of them really spoke to me and said, what are some of your favorite podcast personalities? So I kind of couldn't pin it down to one or even 2, and instead I named several, and one of the groups that I really wanted to recognize, and I felt that strongly about, was Ben, his wife, and their friends, co-hosts on a couple of things, Ray and Michelle. And so there's a very brief, just couple sentence mention of them in the PRX blog interview I recently completed, and there'll be a link in the show notes, folks. And that's, this isn't just, I'm not saying these things because Ben's on the line with me or because they've been previous guests, but I legitimately
Dan.
feel this way. So I want you to check that out as well.
Dan, if you could see the single tear rolling out of my eye right now, it would just warm your heart. But I couldn't even believe that you recommended us at all, much less on PRX. That was like a huge moment for all of us. We're like, we're mentioned on PRX.
When I started this whole thing, my whole goal, Ben, as you probably know and understand by this point, was that I wanted to get people's attention and earballs on the great things I've found. And the reason I keep espousing a couple things is all I'm doing is serving the main purpose I set out for myself when I started this show. It's nothing more than that, right? That's what it is. You guys are a great thing I've found. You're great people. You put out a great product. Everybody should be listening to it, period, end of story. And that's the way I look at it, and that's why I'm going to keep talking about it. So
we really appreciate it, Dan. You've been a huge backer of ours since day one, and just a constant supporter for us, and it really means a lot to all of us to know that we've got Dan from Podcast Digest in our corner.
Well, I appreciate it as well. And I appreciate you guys taking the time to come on here and talk about great stuff.
I'm going to give you a big internet hug right now. Right, the arms are out. Bring it in, buddy.
There you go. Well, I don't have any Pokemon to give you, so just make sure that you fully understand that this comes with no Pokemon.
That's okay. I told my brother-in-law about the exchange of Mr. Mimes that was going to happen, and he about lost his mind. You'll have to listen to a couple things to find out what that's in reference to.
There you go. Well, folks, we're going to put this love affair on pause just for a little while, because this is a recommendation episode, but those of you who know about recommendation episodes, we always open these with a quick discussion topic. And actually, Ben, if you'll do me the favor, Ben brought our discussion topic to the table today, and Ben's used to introducing topics to discuss on his own show. So, Ben, if you do me the honor, tell folks what our discussion topic is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So I myself, much like many of the other podcast listeners out there, are a big fan of true crime podcasts. I love Sword and Scale, love Accused, which we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. But I was thinking the other day as I was listening to some of the other shows out there, really Serial kind of kicked off the mainstream true crime podcast, if you will, at least in my mind. And it was a very investigative type of show where you're really trying to find out, is someone guilty or not? My question is, where do you draw the line in the sand between a show that's done to either bring justice or to really answer a question of, a whodunit versus something that's done strictly for entertainment purposes. And I haven't really formed my opinion completely on this, so I'm not going to plant my flag firmly on one side or the other. But I wanted to get your opinion on it as somebody that's obviously a big player in the podcast world and has, I'm sure, listened to many of the same ones that I have. What your thoughts and feelings are on that?
Well, I'll take you up on the second part of your statement. Listen to a lot of the same things you have. Big player in podcast world. I don't know about that yet, but no, it's a really interesting topic, and honestly something I've thought about as well, in the context that, sort of which master are we serving here, right? Is this almost exploitative, or is it educational, or is it informative, or is it eye-opening? And you kind of got to balance those things. I think my take sort of falls in this category for now. There are a lot of let me harken back to my episode last week, and many of you may not have heard it. It was I tried to throw a spotlight on a little bit of a smaller show that I don't think will be small for very long. It was Crazy Good Turns, and they focused a lot on charitable organizations doing great work for people who need it. And one of the things I loved about that show was that they were drawing attention to the work in people who so often don't get enough attention for what they do. And it seems to me a lot in true crime, especially those like, say, Season 1 Serial, or like some of the things we're going to be talking about a little later, Ben, that when we're able to take a look back on investigations and what was done and how the process went, and sort of internally ask ourselves, was enough done? Could things have been done better? I think it's throwing light on really important topics that often happen in the background, often happen without our knowledge. It doesn't make the 6 o'clock news, but yet it's so important what is happening in those investigations, in those police procedures, in the attention or quality of work that is done by those individuals. And I think that component of it, for sure, and there are many others, is of value. And I think this goes all the way back to shows in the 80s. And, I was raised primarily in the 80s, and I think about Unsolved Mysteries, or some of the ones, about missing children and what have you. It's shining a light on things that may not have otherwise had a light shown upon them. And I think that part's important.
I agree. And I think as you look back, especially at some of the ones that really do kind of investigate the investigation, like a serial or an accused, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes, those are things that, you, the average listener, or just kind of the average citizen, you're not really privy to that information. At least myself, when I, prior to listening to these kinds of shows, would hear about a police investigation, you picture it as this very kind of clean-cut thing where everything kind of falls into place and there's a policy and a procedure for everything. But there's really not. Each case is kind of its own unique thing. And while there are some certain guidelines that have to be adhered to, there's really a lot of gray space. And that gray space can really have a big swing on who is accused of what, who is convicted of what. And unfortunately, at that point, you run into issues like personal agendas. Are you really kind of molding the evidence to fit a suspect that you already have in mind? So I completely agree with you on that I think that bringing how an investigation is done to the forefront is very, very important and can help make us more educated citizens. But on the flip side, you look at, and kind of touching back on your kind of 80s, 90s shows like Geraldo, for example, I could see where you would make the case that would sensationalize murder cases or missing children to a point where you're almost removed from the task at hand, which is finding the person or solving the case, and you're really looking at it more as an entertainment value. The way that I kind of liken it is, if I sit down and watch Chicago PD, or if I sit down and watch SVU, those are fictional shows, and I can kind of get lost in the entertainment of it, of the, where's the bad guy, who did it, car crash, shootout, whatever. But I think sometimes when these shows are done, the victim or the missing person is almost viewed as I don't want to say fictitious kind of element, but almost, because you're not really there. It's really just kind of a name and a story. And those names and stories can capture a lot of listeners. I mean, that's obviously very well known based on the number of true crime podcasts that are out there. But I think you have to really decide when you go in, is this something that I'm doing to educate myself and really, again, maybe help solve a problem or help shed light on a larger problem? Or am I doing it just because I want to be on the roller coaster?
You're absolutely right. And what's funny is I think, and I don't know how many of you out there listening right now could necessarily identify with this full aspect of what I'm about to describe here, but I've got sort of a dual personality or like a schizophrenic idea about some of these things. You mentioned, the close cousin of true crime in that genre, like Law and Order and SVU and CSI and all this stuff. Now, here's the thing. My wife loves that stuff. Literally, on some of these other channels that will do it, We or Oxygen or whatever, that will run 16 hours in a row on a weekend day, she would watch them all and could do so and be fine with it. I can't stand it, right? I absolutely cannot stand. And the thing I've always said is that there's so many horrible things in the world. Why would I want to voluntarily surround myself with more of it during my television watching?
Right.
But on a podcast, at least to now, there probably is one somewhere, a fictionalized crime-based podcast. I rarely, if ever, listen to those. But the true crime ones, I think maybe because there is this informative or eye-opening element, matters more. It seems to carry a sense of importance, sort of like the type of shows I was talking about earlier, like Unsolved Mysteries or even Dateline, these type of ones, or, the Chris Hansen with the To Catch a Predator series. That's, to me, appointment and required viewing and very intriguing to me, because it seems like exposing yourself to the reality of the world, be it bad or good or otherwise, only allows you to be a more educated person and be more aware of the reality of this world. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I can completely agree with that sentiment, too. I think actually Sword and Scale puts it pretty well. The worst monsters are real. You do hear some of these stories and you think, can you believe like someone would do that to another person? And it really makes you kind of scratch your head. And I mean, at that point, you could open a whole nother Pandora's box centered around mental illness and treatment and, well, what makes a person a good person versus a bad person. There's a lot of different avenues you can go down there. And I think, oh man, we could fill probably a 5-hour-long podcast with that discussion.
I think somebody has, really.
Yeah.
No, you're right. And there is so many things. And you bring up Sword and Scale. And for those super fans out there who are well aware, I have had a working relationship with the host of Sword and Scale, Mike Boudet. I've actually produced a couple of episodes for them, including one that hit the main feed. I was working a little bit on their sort of Patreon Sword and Scale Plus episodes, but one of the ones that I worked on, the host, Mike, decided to release that to the main feed, and it was a brief episode. It was Sword and Scale Plus, and it focused around domestic violence. And I worked for a week and a half on that episode, collecting that story and writing that script. And Mike and his team assisted me with some of the more technical points and cleaning up some audio and et cetera. But when I was putting that story together as one who's had very limited experience in helping produce a true crime podcast episode, it was important to me that in the end there was that important story, that important lessons to come out. And that's one of the reasons why at the time of this recording, it's the only Plus episode that Mike has released to the main feed, because it actually coincided with National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And I made sure in the script and in the content that I included that resources for those who found themselves in that type of situation were included in 800 numbers, websites, how to support those organizations, because I think that type of thing was important. And if shows like Sword and Scale or others can use the vehicle that they have to make people more educated about the reality of the world, and more importantly, maybe how they can help that reality, I think it's great work.
Yeah, and I know in listening to them before, they've said certain things about, if you think there might be domestic violence occurring, these are things you should look for. Or if you start to notice these things, that may be a situation where maybe a child is in danger. Those are things that I throughout the course of my day would never, ever think about. But to keep those types of things in the back of your mind and become a more educated and well-rounded individual and keep an eye out for those sort of things is very important. And I appreciate particularly Sword and Scale that they've brought those things to the forefront.
Because to your point, Ben, hopefully that will never be your own life.
Right.
But you also work with a bunch of people. And maybe a coworker comes in that office one day and is trying to cover up something, a bruise or something, and then all of a sudden, you maybe can help that person. You know what I mean? That type of situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But lots of things to consider in the true crime genre. Lots of things that, in terms of, is it exploitative or entertainment or educational? Maybe it's all of it. Maybe it's a combination of all of it. And the good thing is there's a ton of shows out there, folks. And we've mentioned several, and we're going to talk about a few more. But before we do that, I wanted to take a quick minute, folks, and tell you a little bit more about this week's show sponsor. I've been telling you about them for several weeks now, and that is my friends at Podbean. Podbean is podcast hosting and monetization. Some of you listening right now are podcast hosts. Maybe you're not happy with your current provider. Maybe you're a super fan listening to this and thinking, I want to start my own show. Podbean answers both of those questions with a great set of solutions, right? If you go to podbean.com/the podcast digest, folks, you're going to get your first month free. And included in that, Podbean's going to give you all kinds of wonderful things that can easily integrate with your existing website, or they can give you your own that's very much like a blog that you can customize a bunch of different themes and colors. If you publish your show there, you're going to be able to share that on all the social networks. You're going to be able to have these awesome embeddable players. You're going to get popular mobile apps, both Android and iOS. And one of the most important things, I talk about this every week, you're going to get comprehensive podcast statistics. Any podcaster out there will tell you it's very easy to become a stat head like me in watching those stats, and Podbean's going to deliver all of that. They've got an online directory of a bunch of different shows. Your show will go in that directory. You're going to have promotional opportunities. You can have integrated monetization tools. You can potentially offer episodes as premium content. It features an advertising platform. You can even create a patron program right there inside of Podbean. There's so many different wonderful offers that come along with trying out Podbean. If you go to podbean.com/TPD for the podcast digest, TPD, as I mentioned, your first month's free to try all this stuff out I'm talking about. So check out that website, that URL. That lets them know that you came from the podcast digest. And my thanks to Podbean for supporting the show. Ben, let's talk about some great podcasts, shall we? We got 2 each, right?
We do.
Let's do it. We're talking true crime stuff. I got one. You got one. Would you like me to go first, or do you want to kind of set the stage for me?
Dan, you are the expert here. I'm going to let you go first.
Expert. Too complimentary. Honestly, Molly was the expert. She did this very well. And believe me, she's listening. Your wife is listening to this right now to see how you're doing, Ben.
Oh, I'm sure she is. I don't know how she's tapped in, but she's tapped in somehow.
I'll take the first one. Let's see if I can set it up for you. True crime. We've been talking about it so far this episode, folks. And I've got one that I've really fallen in love with. And Ben, I know you're familiar with this as well, so I'll come to you here in just a few to get your take as well. My show is called In the Dark from APM Reports. It is a true crime-based podcast. It is taking a look back at a child abduction back from 1989 in rural Minnesota. This is a really interesting show. A couple of things about it I want you guys to know. One, I believe all or most of the episodes are now out, so it is completely bingeable. You can literally blast through this thing, which I'll be honest with you up front, I'm in the process of doing. I've not quite finished this, but I feel so strongly about what I've heard so far, I wanted to recommend it to you guys. The host is Madeline Baran. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Madeline, but she is the host, and one of her main partners in this endeavor is her producer. Producer is Samara Freemark, and these two ladies have put together an amazing product based on investigative journalism, taking a look back at this case from way back when. Now, one of the stage setting pieces to this show that makes it a little bit different than most of sort of these true crime based podcasts that we've been talking about that have been so popular since the season 1 of Serial, is that right before this show was going to be released, they sort of had an amazing kind of change in what they thought they were going to be releasing to the world. And that's because they got a confession from the person who actually admitted to this crime, a child abduction back from 1989 in rural Minnesota. That sort of set the show in a very different way. But the show went forward, and I'm very happy that it did. And sort of like Ben and I were talking about a few minutes back, it takes a serious, hard look about what the police and the sheriff's office and the investigators assigned to the case, and even the FBI, did to try to solve this problem. And could they have brought the kidnapper and ultimately the murderer, really, to justice long before they ultimately did? And it's, with these true crime shows, I think the most important element is that there is an element of storytelling. And what I mean by that is that so many of these crimes, so many of these stories are so complicated. There's so many different factors and timelines and people and issues and different sides of what went down, that being able to interweave this into a listenable story is so important to make this story appealing to a listener, so that some of the messages in that story can come through. A lot of like what Ben and I have been discussing in our discussion topic. And I think In the Dark and the team there have done it amazingly well. This was a huge national attention style case back in 1989, and it had a huge effect on a lot of things that nowadays we consider normal, like changes in the nation's sex offender registry, the concept of stranger danger, and some of the things you tell young children on what to do if a stranger were to approach them. This was one of those national attention stories that sort of really impacted the kind of fibers of society, and kind of cultural norms were changed and adjusted based on what went down here. So far, what I've heard has been a stupendous investigation. They have talked to so many people and gotten their perspective on what happened back then, what people saw, what the police and sheriff's department did or didn't do. And it's been an amazing tale so far, that pulling back of the curtain of what happened. And it is something that I think anyone, I don't know if enjoys the right word. There are some tough stories told in here. In an early episode, there's a recounting of the murderer's testimony after he confessed of exactly what he did to this poor child. And that's really, really hard to listen to. But I think this idea of educating yourself about investigations into these type of crimes is an eye-opening experience. So, Ben, you told me before we sat down to record that you are familiar with this show, yes?
Yes, and I actually was not as lucky as you were, because I found it, I think, at episode 2 or 3, so I was not able to binge. I had to listen to one, anxiously wait, listen to the next one, anxiously wait. But I agree with you that it's a very good look at the kind of behind the curtain, the investigation part of it, really an investigation of the investigation. And the fact that they've kind of dropped that bomb on you up front of, hey, we already know who did it, really allows you to look at it through a different lens. Instead of focusing on what is the end goal here, the focus is really more on how did we go down the road to get to the end goal, and maybe what could have been done differently. I do very much sympathize with you when you said that one of the early episodes is difficult to listen to when they recount what happened to Jacob Wetterling. It's very tough to listen to, and it really kind of makes you think a little bit about your own mortality and, hey, how this really could happen to anybody. But in my opinion, they did a really good job of showcasing kind of the family's opinion on it and what they went through throughout this whole process. They did a really good job and were very respectful in the way that they went about it, while also really kind of getting to the bottom of some different things. But the really kind of interesting thing for me looking at it was what the investigation was like back then versus what it's like today. Because now you assume with technology and new investigative techniques that there's DNA on everything and we can find anybody. And I don't want to say anybody, but we have a pretty good chance of finding anybody that might be missing or has gone, or finding out who did it. But those types of things really didn't exist back then. So your kind of little boxes that you needed to check off in order to find out who may have committed this crime were much smaller in quantity than they are today.
Yeah, and that appears to be a fairly common theme in a lot of these true crime and I don't know if that's the right word, retroactive investigative journalism type shows where they are sort of retaking apart a particular crime, whether there was a murderer charged, not charged, still open, cold case, whatever the case may be. They really do kind of draw out that difference between then and now. And it makes you almost wonder, 27 years from now, if we can look back that far now and say, they didn't have this, they didn't have that, they did the best they could. What are we going to be saying 27 years from this point, in terms of looking back at our own technology and capabilities at this point?
Yeah, and the biggest thing that I remember thinking was, it's really kind of interesting that you take for granted today that essentially everybody has a cell phone. And you've got a pretty good chance of knowing that cell phone is going to be on them at any point. So one of the first things they do is, who was the last person they texted? Where was the last place that their GPS pinged on their phone? Back then, when this case was taking place, that wasn't the case at all. You're basically riding off of what other people are telling you and kind of trying to build this puzzle based off of stories that, may have some factual information and may not.
Yeah, that was even pre-pager. That's how far back that was. It's an amazing story, folks. I haven't finished it. I know Ben's gotten much further in. I think both of us can firmly stand behind this recommendation. It's called In the Dark, an APM Reports podcast. And I'll just mention this to the side. No promises, folks. I do have an inquiry out. And maybe at some point in the future, I'll be able to have a conversation with that host and producer, and we'll talk more about In the Dark in the future. But we'll see what happens. In the meantime, it's time for me to pass the talking stick over to Ben Mendenhall for our second, I believe, true crime-based podcast recommendation. Ben, the stage is yours.
All right. I am going to recommend Accused this week. It is a podcast actually produced by the Cincinnati Enquirer, hosted and produced by Amber Hunt and Amanda Rossman. The interesting thing for me about this particular podcast is that it actually takes place in our hometown, Cincinnati, which I'm sure a lot of you that live in New York and Chicago and LA are used to having your city be kind of the host for a show or an event or whatever it may be. But Cincinnati, unfortunately, doesn't get a lot of traction in the podcast world. I know that's very hard to believe, Dan. But
I believe it.
This show actually investigates the unsolved murder of Beth Andes that took place in 1978 in Oxford, Ohio, at Miami University. And to give you some background, Beth Andes was a student at Oxford that was found killed in her apartment at the time. And the investigation honed in very, very quickly on her boyfriend, Bob Young, who is the prime suspect. And he unfortunately was kind of tried in the court of public opinion and in the media. And very quickly, the thought was, Bob did it. He's guilty. In fact, Bob even confesses at one point to the crime. But as things start to play out more, you begin to realize maybe everything that they thought they had regarding his guilt isn't really the case. This, though, is a little bit different than in the dark because ultimately there still is no answer for the end listener. And they will tell you that up front, that there really is no sort of, point where they're going to sit there and say, this person did it, and we can tell you that unequivocally. So this also is kind of an investigation of the investigation, because similar to In the Dark, again, they start to go back in time and you look at some of these things that may have gone wrong in terms of letting a key witness or maybe a key person that may have been involved just completely fly off the radar blind. And the other thing that's actually very interesting, since this is, again, hosted somewhat near me, you start to hear names and people that pop up that are actually still in government office today or in law enforcement in some way, shape, or form, and things that they've done that you begin to look at them and think, well, why did they do that this way? Or what made them make that decision? Or why have they continued to think along these same lines? So that really presented, at least to me, kind of a real element to it, because I've seen these people. They're very real. I see their election signs floating around yards around this time of year. But the series is very, very well done. Again, it was from the Cincinnati Enquirer. That they actually have a very nice web page laid out at cincinnati.com/series/accused that supplements the podcast. And they have some different things in terms of character breakdowns and a visual representation of timelines that really supplement this podcast very well and can create a very clear picture of the investigation. Now, the two hosts have been exhaustive in the research. To say that they've left any stone unturned or nook or cranny unexplored would not be giving them credit. They have done everything to the point of, I want to say, even to the point of annoyance of some people that they are trying to get answers from. But I think this is a very well done true crime podcast because it does really focus on A, the investigation, and B, it focuses on how the family has moved forward without really ever having any sort of closure on this case, which you can imagine is a very, very difficult thing to do.
Yeah. Great show. Thoroughly enjoyed this one, blew right through it. And when you say it'd be an understatement that they've left any stone unturned, that in and of itself is an understatement. Amanda, I believe, is Amanda or Amber is the host. I don't have my notes in front of me here.
I believe Amber is the primary.
Amber is the primary host that we hear from, and she does a spectacular job. And I love listening to her narration because she actively participated in the investigation, and you can hear at different intervals in the process that her and that group went through that she does get exasperated, that she does feel frustrated herself that they weren't able to make more progress, and that dialogue just sort of takes you along for that ride because you can almost put yourself in Amber's shoes where you're like, why won't they return this call? Why can't they find this? That type of thing. Spectacularly done. And again, sort of like we were talking about most of this episode at this point, really shines a light on something that needs a light shown upon it. And great show. My full recommendation as well.
Yeah, and it seems like the hosts for this podcast aren't out to sensationalize it. They're not out to kind of make the story bigger than it is. It seems like I don't know them. I can't say this definitively, but it seems like their hearts are in the right place and that they're doing it for the right reason to really try to help bring some closure. And folks, I may or may not have an invite out to those hosts of Accused as well. Who don't you have, Dan? What can I say? I want to go behind the scenes of some of these great shows, and these last two we've talked about. I'd love to know more about what it took to put together these things we hear. I believe In the Dark was a 9-month expedition for the team that put it together, and I believe The Accused was more than a year it took to assemble what we get to subscribe to and hear for free.
but the work and the time and the energy and the effort I know, not to give anything away, but in the last episode of Accused, Amber talks about how she has been more or less personally affected by this experience, and I just want to learn and know more about what that experience has been like. So,
which I cannot imagine putting that kind of effort into a podcast. I mean, heck, for us, we'll show up, we'll grab a couple beers, everybody got their topics. Yep, let's roll.
Pretty much the same here, Ben.
Yeah.
But, we are talking about shows on a completely different scale of investment and involvement in production, and that's one of the reasons. It's one of the reasons you and I get to talk about them, because we stand in awe of what these folks have accomplished. Really,
we're not worthy.
Let's move on to a little bit of a change of pace. Talking a lot about crime and some heavy topics. We've got a little bit lighter stuff for you in our show 3 and 4 recommendations. I'm up next. My second show recommendation, the third of this episode. I'm going back. I feel a lot. This episode 113, folks, is really kind of settling into some of my favorite and most comfortable things. I love the true crime genre. I love Ben and couple things, but another thing I love is a little tech-based network called Relay FM. I have featured interviews with many of the hosts from that network, including founders Mike Hurley and Stephen Hackett, and it probably, from a network standpoint, percentage-wise, has most of the highest percentage of shows subscribed to in my listening queue. One of the shows that I've not yet talked anything at all about is a show called Reconcilable Differences. It is co-hosted by John Siracusa, previous guest on the Podcast Digest, as well as Merlin Mann. Gentlemen, I would love to have as a guest on the Podcast Digest.
What a great name.
Yes. These two hosts, folks, are venerable giants in the technology space. And if you think I'm kidding, I want you to be clear that I'm not. John Siracusa is a longtime Apple columnist. He used to do Mac operating system reviews for a better part of a decade. He sports 64,000 followers on Twitter. And actually, I will divulge this. Most podcasters never talk numbers, nor am I per se. But when I had John on the show, it has been and continues to be the most popular episode of the Podcast Digest, my conversation with John Siracusa. And as impressive and as wonderful as that is, his co-host for that show, Merlin Mann at Hot Dogs Ladies on Twitter, is sporting a following of 353,000 followers on Twitter. So these are not little tiny people, talking about, technology. In fact, this particular show from Relay FM hardly talks about technology at all. Yes, there are some references, as it is generally the background for both Merlin and John. But what's neat about this is that these two excellent conversationalists tackle topics in the world that tend to come to, for lack of a better reference, middle-aged men, right? They are sort of using their wisdom and life experience to kind of take apart different topics, different observations, different things that they experience either as parents or as spouses or observations on the world. Or I think the kind of catch line for Reconcilable Differences is they try to reconcile how they became who they are, right, through their life experiences, because they both have very opinionated takes on life in the news and what's going on in the world. And for me, John Siracusa might be, if I had to pick one name, my favorite podcaster of all time. And I say that with all the strength of conviction that comes behind that.
That's a strong
statement.
endorsement.
Yes. The intellectual discussion style that John has is matched only by somebody like Merlin Mann, and their back and forth is amazing. They, usually when you have a host, and Ben, you could probably do this, right, with a couple things. You guys all sort of over time sort of fit a particular mold on your shows. You kind of play roles, like, one maybe is more humor, you make the animal sounds, so on and so forth. And what's great about Merlin and John is they have always been sort of the intellectual conversationalist, the sort of one that kind of breaks down a particular topic with a point of view one may not have heard about, but they both serve that role in other respective shows. And what was great about Reconcilable Differences was when they came together, it was combining two very similar characters in the sense of how the role they would typically play on a podcast. And to hear these two go at it, we're talking an hour and a half, 2 to 2.5 hour long episodes, and they just discuss. And I'm probably not giving a great description of the show. It's something that you really would have to check out and see if it's something that you would appreciate. But for me, I love it. Two great podcast personalities. They appear to be, to me, very great people. Like I said, I was fortunate enough to talk with John, and it was one of the highlights of my experience with this show so far. And I just wanted to throw my recommendation behind it. So, folks, if this sounded interesting to you, check out Reconcilable Differences from Relay FM.
I'm going to add it immediately to the download list. Download list, rather.
It's a super cool show.
Yeah,
I love it. It's a must listen for me. So, but now it's time for a must listen from you. You've got our fourth show recommendation. Ben Mendenhall, what you got?
So, Dan, as you know, and as we've discussed, I've been in a little bit of a dark place in the sports world here recently. My Cubs, they're down 2-1 in the series right now.
As we record,
it's not looking
folks
good. Folks
listening to this right now know more than we do right now, Ben.
Yes, they do. They may be laughing at me in the future, going, "They got smoked tonight." But to help me get through some of these tough times and try to commiserate with my fellow Cub fans, I'm going to endorse Ivy Envy this week. Their tagline is "Strong Opinions and Marginal Analysis of the Chicago Cubs." Ivy Envy is hosted by Corey Finneran, Andy, who has never disclosed his last name, and Kurt Tucker. They started the show in 2008, so they're on their 8th season, and they really just do analysis of the Chicago Cubs. But it's done in a very, I don't want to call it family-friendly type of way necessarily, but it's very much a style where you could say, I would sit down at a bar and talk to those guys about baseball. They're all very knowledgeable. They all have a great understanding of the game. They'll admit up front they are absolutely 100% Homer biased fans. But that's part of what makes the show great for me, because you get the analysis and you get the stats and the breakdown of the games, but you also get that emotional element of, I understand these things are happening, but it doesn't mean it doesn't make me upset or make me very happy that they're winning or whatever the case may be. They actually, to their credit, throughout the playoffs, have been recording an episode after every single game. I mean, some of these games last night, they had to have recorded their game or their podcast at 1 o'clock in the morning after a brutal loss, and they cranked out 45 minutes of quality content for us, the listeners, and particularly the commiserators, to get the following day. So I am a huge fan of theirs. They're a great listen, great quality show. You can actually support them on Patreon at patreon.com/IvyEnvy and find them online at ivyenvy.com. Again, I'm hoping that I don't sound very, very stupid today and the Cubs get absolutely just obliterated for the rest of the series and I'm having to cry into my beer by the end of the week.
Well, if they do get obliterated, and people listening to this now have realized the Cubs have gone home for the 109th consecutive year, people may want to tune into Ivy Envy to hear their take on that.
They may very well do that. I will say, though, depending on how the Cubs are doing really necessitates how quickly I'll listen to Ivy Envy. If it's a great win, I want to listen to it right away. Brutal loss, I need a couple days to stew on it before I like today, for example. They had recently lost, and I thought, you know what? Maybe I'll download that one after lunch. I need something to kind of bring me back up in the morning before I face reality. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of these guys. We've actually, a couple things, have had some interactions with them on Twitter. They're very personable guys. They do a great job keeping up with their social media accounts and shouting out people that support them on Patreon on their show. So I would absolutely, if you have any interest, not even in the Cubs, but just in baseball in general, give Ivy Envy a listen.
Excellent. I love when myself or co-host on a recommendation show is able to talk about a sports podcast, because it is a blind spot, I think, for the Podcast Digest. And I love the fact that you're able to hear and tell folks about another great show, especially if they're a Cubs fan. And maybe the Cubs will be adding some fans here in the near future, depending on what happens in these next little bit. And regardless of whether you make it to the streets of Chicago for the celebration or not.
That's still a hotly debated topic, Dan.
That is a recent Couple Things episode reference, folks. So if you want to know what I'm referring to, check out Couple Things.
Dan, I've got a hot take for you here.
Oh,
just like all the sports shows. Are you ready?
Yeah.
We do one episode every single day for a week of all the sports shows I recommend. Bang, where we sign. I'm ready to do it.
You could use the point system, right? You guys could have a spin-off show with just you and Ray on sports show recommendations.
Right. I got the name already. Couple balls.
There you go. There you
Baseball,
go.
basketball, football, soccer ball.
It's just waiting for it to be signed up for and released.
I will trademark it immediately.
Folks, before we go forward, I want to just make a quick comment. When Ben and I were talking about Accused, I kind of was lost a little bit on Amber or Amanda on who was talking about it. And I just did a little bit of research. And when Ben was telling us about Ivy Envy, and I realized why I did that. Kind of the two main front people for the show are both Amber Hunt and Amanda Rossman. So I was mixing them up. So my apologies to Amber and Amanda, but I know now why I was kind of mixing it up, because they were both hosts and journalists working on that project for the Cincinnati Enquirer. So with that out of the way, before we wrap things up, Ben Mendenhall, thank you so much for joining me on episode 113 and taking your turn on the Couple Things recommendation merry-go-round.
Thank you for having me, man. Thank you for having me. I only hope I can live up to the massively high bar that my wife set.
Well, I'll say you've passed Ray, but you'll have to take it up with him. Only because I want to see you guys argue about it in the future. But I'm just kidding, Ray. You were great as well.
100% happen.
I can't pick a favorite. It can't work that way.
I get it. I know I'm your favorite.
If folks want to hear more from my favorite, as well as the rest of the Couple Things gang, Ben, tell them where they can find your awesome show.
Yeah, so they can find us obviously on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud. Just search Couple Things Podcast. You can also find us on Twitter at Couple Things Pod. You can find us on Instagram as well. We are members of the Wicked Radio and Tangent Bound Network. And you can also find us old school on the interwebs at couplethingspodcast.com.
Do it, ladies and gentlemen. I'll tell you, this is a recommendation show. I love Couple Things. I love the four of them. I think they're great people. They put out a great show, a great product. You will love it. Every time it drops Tuesday mornings, it will be a highlight for you. I promise you. Check
I love you, Dan.
Thanks again, Ben. I really appreciate it, man.
Thanks, Dan.
Folks, that'll do it for episode 113, Recommendation Show. Thanks again for Ben for joining me from Couple Things. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, tell somebody about it. Share the show on Twitter. Write a little review, or better yet, support the show on Patreon. You can become one of those supporters who gets all the behind-the-scenes information. And if you are a podcaster looking for a better home for your show, or considering becoming a podcaster and wanting to figure out where to start, check out this week's show sponsor, podbean.com/TPD for the Podcast Digest. That'll get you your first month hosting for free. And if you use that special URL, podbean.com/TPD, they'll know you came from here, and I'll be forever thankful. Thanks, guys. My name's Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest. That'll do it for this week. I'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.